The continuum hypothesis underlies modern theories of space and time. And yet, once again, this hypothesis is strictly unprovable scientifically. You just have to assume it to be true. Third example, the one-way velocity of light. The one-way velocity of light. In the special theory of relativity, you must simply assume that light travels at a constant speed in one direction. We have no way of proving this, however. All we are able to measure is the round-trip velocity of light, the two-way velocity of light. But theoretically, it's possible that light could go out at one direction at one speed and come back at a slower speed. And we would never know it because we can only measure the round-trip velocity of light. We cannot measure the one-way velocity of light. And yet the entire special theory of relativity hinges upon the assumption that light travels at a constant speed in one direction. These are just some of the examples of unprovable assumptions which lie at the foundations of science. Second way in which this can be shown is that the scientific method itself cannot be scientifically justified. This is the old problem of induction. Just because every time in the past phenomenon A has been followed by phenomenon B is no guarantee that the next time you see phenomenon A, that it will be followed by phenomenon B. It might be the case that we are at the beginning of a chaotic series of A's and B's, and it's only the initial segment that is ordered A, B, A, B, A, B. We simply have to assume some principle of regularity in the universe and that our sample is typical. But this cannot be scientifically proved. Now, I want to emphasize that in sharing all of these various examples with you this morning, I am not trying to reduce you to skepticism. I don't think we should be skeptical about any of these things. Rather, what I'm trying to get you to see is that this criterion is a hopelessly flawed criterion of rationality, and therefore it ought to be rejected. It is simply far too restrictive a criterion for rational belief. Second critique is even more fundamental. This criterion turns out to be self-refuting. Just ask yourself the question, is the statement, we should only rationally believe what is self-evident, incorrigible, or scientifically proven, is that statement self-evident, incorrigible, or scientifically proven? Well, obviously not. And therefore, by its own criterion, we should not believe in that criterion. You would be irrational to believe that we should only believe what is incorrigible, self-evident, or scientifically proven. And thus, according to the criterion, we ought to reject the criterion. And thus it is self-refuting and therefore is untenable. The point then is this. Epistemologists today recognize that there are certain properly basic beliefs which cannot be scientifically proven, but which we are all rational in accepting. Laymen would probably say that we believe them by faith, but I think it would be less misleading to say that these are part of the deliverances of reason. They are part of the very foundations of a rational cognitive structure. Now, what implications does all of this have for belief in God? Well, very simply, it raises the question, why can't belief in God be a properly basic belief? That would not mean that it's arbitrary, any more than my belief in the external world or the presence of other minds is arbitrary. Rather, it would be a belief which is grounded in my immediate experience of God himself. Jesus said, if any man's will is to do God's will, then he will know whether my teaching is from God or whether I'm speaking on my own authority. According to the New Testament, God speaks to and draws the heart of every human being to himself. If we respond to this witness of the Holy Spirit with an open mind and an open heart, then God will make his existence a reality to us. In such a case, then, proofs for God's existence, even though they are still cogent, must take a back seat. To give an illustration, suppose you go to the office where you work and you want to know if the boss is in his office. You might ask the secretary, is the boss in? And she might say, yes, he is in his office this morning. You might also notice light under the door of the office. And you might hear the sound of the boss's voice as he is talking on the telephone. And on the basis of all of this evidence, you would rationally conclude that the boss is in the office. But there's another way you might come to that conclusion. You might go, knock on the door, and open the door and meet the boss face to face. Now, in that case, even though all of the evidence of the secretary's testimony, the light under the door, the sound of his voice on the telephone, still remains cogent evidence for the boss as being in the office, now that evidence becomes secondary because now you've met the boss face to face. Now, in exactly the same way, once we've met God face to face, so to speak, the proofs for his existence, though still cogent and important, necessarily become secondary. Now, does this mean then that for Christian believers we take the existence of God by faith? Well, again, I think that would be misleading. For the Christian, belief in the existence of God is part of the deliverances of reason. It is a properly basic belief. Faith, in the true biblical sense of that word, means trust or commitment. In the biblical sense of the word, it's entirely possible to believe that God exists without really believing in God. That is to say, you can believe that God exists without really putting your faith in him, your trust, your commitment in God. In fact, when you think about it, probably most people find themselves in this position. I think most people in society believe that God exists, but they don't really believe in God in the sense of committing their lives to him in trust and love and commitment. And I think that's why we find so few genuine Christians in Western society today. In the biblical sense of the word, true faith involves not just believing that God exists, but committing one's life to him and walking with him day by day. In conclusion, then, we found that the idea that we should only believe what can be scientifically proven is far too restrictive a criterion of rationality, and in the end is self-refuting. Many of our most important beliefs cannot be scientifically proven, and yet they are entirely rational to entertain. Now, in this sense, one might say that we accept them by faith. Similarly, belief in God's existence can also be entirely rational without being based on scientific evidence. And a layman might similarly say we accept the existence of God by faith. But I think that it's less misleading and more accurate to say that in both of these cases, such beliefs are among the deliverances of reason, and we should reserve the notion of faith to describe that relationship of love, trust, and commitment which ought rightly to characterize our walk with God.